For more on these 62 Indigenous cultural items, we're now joined by Cody Groat. He's an assistant professor of history and Indigenous studies at Western University. Thanks so much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
There's so much ceremony around the return and repatriation of these items and a lot of significance. Let's first talk about the meaning of these cultural objects for the First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities to have them return.
I think we really have two competing worldviews at play here. For almost a century, these have been viewed as artifacts that have been housed in a museum collection, climate-controlled vaults, likely put behind glass display cases. But for a lot of the nations who are repatriating these items today, these are ancestors. These have a life or a sentience of their own. And that's how we're going to be treating these items upon their return to North America. I really have been seeing a pushback against this use of the word artifact towards more cultural ancestors. And I think if we look at it from that perspective, this really does show a new meaning to the story.
Juanita Taylor just had her item talking about how these items ended up at the Vatican in the first place 100 years ago, all because of this exhibition with the Pope inviting these Catholic missionaries to bring back these Indigenous items and Indigenous materials to be part of this exhibition. But there are questions about whether these were taken or whether they were actually gifts. Can you talk about how complicated that part of the story is?
Again, it's really two different worldviews. We do know that for a lot of Indigenous nations in what is now Canada, we do have this diplomatic history of gift giving to establish relationships with other nations or with church officials, for instance. And the Vatican is really relying on that narrative when they are releasing statements saying that these were gifted to them and now they're engaging in ecclesiastical gift giving and returning these items. But we have to really look at the timeline here. A lot of these items did enter the hands of the Vatican in the 1920s as part of this exhibition celebrating missionary endeavors. When we look at what was happening here in North America in the 1920s, we know that this is really when the Indian Act was at its most assimilatory. Cultural practices were actively being banned, and we saw those provisions of banning cultural practices being pushed by entities like the Catholic Church. We saw the Indian residential school system fully in effect, again, an active role by the Catholic Church, and traditional forms of government like the hereditary council at Six Nations of the Grand River, where I'm from, that was actively banned through the Indian Act and an elected system was imposed. So again, we do have these diplomatic histories of gift giving in many Indigenous nations, but to paint this entire process of these items being gifted and now being gifted back, that's being pushed back against, and I think it is fairly contestable.
Let's talk about what this means for reconciliation. How important is this step in that process?
So Pope Francis really did have an influential role in this. I'd say that what really kick-started this repatriation that we're seeing today is his visit here to Canada, where he apologized for the role of the Catholic Church in the Indian residential school system. Quite famously, on his flight back to the Vatican, he acknowledged that this was a genocidal system, responding to a CBC reporter. And we also know that Pope Francis, when discussing these cultural items, cited the Bible, one of the 10 Commandments, saying if something is stolen, it should be returned. That's quite different language than what we're seeing for this current Pope, Pope Leo. But we've heard from the Pope, he apologized for the role of the Catholic Church in the residential school system. Now we're seeing tangible action being taken. This was a specific request made by many Indigenous nations to have our cultural items repatriated, and now this request is being acted upon. So as much as I can contest some of the language that Pope Leo is using, I think the fact that he's acting on this so early into his papacy is quite significant as well.
Finally, I just want to ask you really quickly, this is only the beginning because there remain other Indigenous cultural items at the Vatican. Where do you see things moving from here?
Now, one thing that the Vatican has been very particular about is framing this as a church-to-church transfer. The Vatican is gifting these to the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops with the expectation that they will be returned to Indigenous nations. The Vatican is using this language, I believe, quite intentionally because they know other requests are going to be made, not only in Canada, but I think around the world. The Vatican's collections really are quite international in their scope and scale. So the Vatican would like to dictate a process that they have the chance to control and nuance into the future. But I do believe that this does set the precedence. This lays the groundwork that is necessary for future repatriation efforts. So in my opinion, overall, it is quite a good news story.
And for now, we'll keep an eye on those dozens of Indigenous cultural items returning to Canadian soil today. Cody Groat, thank you so much for your time and for your insight this morning.
Thank you.